Good morning, class. It is indeed a wonderful morning, I want to say, because before we get into the lesson, I'll just comment briefly about some things that occurred yesterday here in Buchanan. We are so happy for, I think, great results for our booth that was set up at the Fried Pie Festival. And what I saw personally encouraged me as much as anything in you, this congregation. All of you so involved, everyone spent a great deal of time doing his or her part, not only in preparation, but also during the actual time people were passing by, many going out of their way to speak to them and encourage others to take literature and packages and sign up for the Bible giveaway. All these things we did to get people to stop by and realize that the Lord's people are here in town. So I thank all of y'all so much, and some who are not in here. We need to let our young people know especially just how great a job that they did. It was one, I think, that's going to have long-lasting results. And I always knew that that would be a key. Young faces, it gets people excited to see various generations coming along and standing for the same things, standing for biblical truth. And that's what we were doing. So I know now the community is aware of our presence if they were not before. And we were made aware of the fact some even knew about our given outreach. We had some, I think maybe one or two at least, to actually verbalize that they tune into our radio broadcast. So they were familiar with that we have it. We had the banner hanging up there and to show that we have the weekly broadcasts. At first, I misunderstood. I thought one of the men who mentioned that was talking about our daily spot. Somebody might have. Seems like maybe some individual did mention hearing about the advertising about the Fried Pie Festival and our booth there. So that may have been the case as well. That goes out during the week. We have various 1-minute spots that we hear each day. So I think all in all, a lot of good was done. I have no idea at this point of how many passed by the booth, but we can safely assume several thousand, but no, we're talking tens of thousands. I wouldn't be surprised, if you go to a high school football game and all the bleachers are filled, I don't know what Bremen's capacity is, but you have maybe 8,000 or 10,000? Would they hold that many? I'm not sure. But if you could just imagine a football stadium and everybody files by from it, I think there'd be less than maybe what came by yesterday. I'm just not sure, because some did come by more than once. Anyway, maybe those stats will come out before long, and we can, I guess, infer that whatever the stats are overall for those who visited, the vast majority of them probably passed by our booth. So it was a good day, I think, and I want to thank Susan, for example, for making up these little gift packages, the little bags that were given out. We gave them all away. How many were there? 50? And they were all given away. And the key to that is they contain a number of things. For example, the ink pens and the pads that have our name on it. So there'll be name recognition as long as they're carrying that pen around and they take a look at it. It has our name on it and address, the pads as well. And then tracts, things of that nature that talk about even the plan of salvation. If we're not mistaken, there's a brief note about that. So we know let's get that shot at it, a hearing of the word, if they take the time out to read that. And other things that are provided, little amenities to show we care about them. But it was a way also of getting them to see the fact that we're here and what our message is, see the message. I want to point this out, which is an obvious truth. That goes way back to our Lord. He spoke of those who hungered and thirsted for righteousness. And I was just speaking with Betty on the way over here about this. It strikes me that God designed our human bodies such that it will send a signal to make us aware. It sends it to our brain, our central nervous system, or however that works, to let us know when there's a deficiency, such as the need for hydration. You can't go long at all without water, or the body perishes. Everybody knows that. That's a truism. It's obvious. So when people are out in the heat, like they were yesterday, walking around, sweating, they will need hydration. And there is a signal sent from, I don't know how the body works. I'm not sure of the physiology, but they get the message. They sense thirst. They have a sense of thirst for water. So they see we were offering free water bottles, cold water. We were giving out the water out of an act of kindness. And as Reagan pointed out, it was a pretty good ploy to get people to come by. That was cute. to our booth. and that's really what it was. But the purpose was to also give them some hydration as they needed it. And they took it. When they saw it, they took it because they felt the need. That's my point. They felt it. They sensed it. So now, why weren't they flocking to our tent, begging us for tracts and begging to sign up for correspondence courses or to find out where we meet so they can hear our sermons? Well, a few did show interest like that, but the majority who walked by asking for water sensed the need for water. They felt the thirst. In our country today, in our culture, such that we have trained ourselves as individuals to stifle that sense of thirst for spiritual things, things that matter. And I don't know if you could train the body, maybe you can, to deny the signal being sent is that for water. I need water, I need hydration, and make it think that it's something else that's needed. And they knew the difference. Some of them would come by with soft drinks and they would say, this is not cutting it. It's not, I gotta have the water. And of course that's true when we're really thirsty. Is there something about us where there's a need, a sense of guilt, but we've misinterpreted that signal being sent to our souls, our spirits, and we tell ourselves, oh, it's something else, and we satisfy it, we're satiated with something that's not really the hydration that's needed, that signal was originally trying to tell us, the sense of guilt, the sense that we need to get right with God. I don't know all about the psychology there. I can only speculate that somehow so many do train themselves to ignore that sense of spiritual thirst. But thankfully, some have interpreted correctly what the need is, and they are seeking for it. So that's why we're here. Well, I don't mean to take all morning to talk about the Fried Pie Festival, but I think it worked out pretty well. So any comments or questions about that, maybe lessons learned that would help us in the future? Because you do gain experience, and experience has to be valuable for some reason. Any comments or anything we see that worked well that we might want to try to improve on?
Did anybody count how many people signed up for the Bible, and are we going to take that information and follow up on those contacts? I don't think we did.
Well, the problem with that is that they didn't give full information. The most you could do would be send a text message. Some few, I think, might have left their email addresses on there as well. In those cases, yes, we could certainly send a note saying, we congratulate you for signing up, and just to invite them to church, of course. But you couldn't follow up in the same way as if we had actual physical addresses given. So I don't know that we could do that directly. I don't know if that would work. Maybe in the future we could rework it. Well, certainly we send text, yes. We send a text. We don't want it to come across as haranguing, though. And of course, I know it's not just to send a text. We want to, if we do it, it will just be a polite note, once again, to remind them of us, and to be able to create the right kind of goodwill, at least to try to break down any resistance or bad will that might exist, prejudice in the community. We could do that, but we wouldn't want people to think if they signed up for that we're necessarily go knock on their door for that reason. If we're knocking doors and we come across them, we have good excuses to knock doors already. So I hope we can do that. Hope we can find people at home. And remember, we have a gospel meeting coming up next week, beginning next week. So we need to maybe come up with a plan too for this coming Saturday, the Lord willing, if all are available. Go out and pass out flyers and just invite people again. And maybe then connections could be made. Hopefully, if some of the locals are living in the area we're visiting, well, we can see them and they will be reminded, if maybe some of them that even signed up for the Bible, the fact that it's this group that's having the meeting. All right, so, well, that's something to consider for the future, what we might want to do with those cards if we want other information. And certainly in the case where we have like email addresses, I would see that wouldn't hurt to send a message, or if y'all want to send text messages, we could do that as well. Just invite them to come once more. I think many did do that yesterday. Heard several inviting people to come visit yesterday. Any other lessons or comments or ideas for the future, or things we could leave off, things we could add? I thought it went pretty well. I don't guess it was without any hitch. I don't guess it's perfect, but it seemed like it was better this time because of our location. We had prime location right by the old courthouse, right by the entranceway. in front of the Historical Society tent, a kind of an area where everybody would congregate anyway, across the street from Los Cowboys. Pretty good place. No other comments on that before we get to our Bible lesson in the Gospel of John? All right, once more, I want to thank everyone here, each and every one, for helping to make this possible and for your prayers. By the way, let's remember, this is not icing on the cake, sort of an afterthought. Obviously, when I say, let's remember in prayer to make specific petition to God on behalf of the seed planted yesterday. Well, all that we do, of course, but in particular, think of those that received the little packages, the gift packages with the tracts, and others who picked up tracts. Also, on behalf of our radio outreach, if everyone here would just pray regularly that some searching soul out there in the providence of God would be within the sound of our voice, under the signal somewhere, to the extent the program could be heard if they're traveling in a car, in a sufficient way to get enough of the message to think, to maybe check up with us and find out more, or to do research in their own town where they locate churches of Christ. So you never know. There are travelers who can hear. So, for example, the Tallapoosa station, it can easily be picked up on I-20. So if there are travelers from interstate travelers, they'll be able to hear it. If you have the type that are the thinking types and are not the shallow-minded types listening to hip-hop or country, well, if they're listening to country, they're going to be, they might come across our program. One guy said yesterday he hears our broadcasts, and he said, I love that. I love the music they have, the gospel music they play all afternoon on WKNG on Sundays. So that's what he was searching for, and we happen to be right in the middle of all that gospel music, so-called, I'll have to add, so-called gospel music that they do play ad nauseum. But anyway, people are listening for whatever reason, but travelers could hear. Just think about right now down in Americas, people coming from Fort Benning, going over to Buena Vista, and going over, I don't know if it makes it all the way over to Fort Valley, but Americas, down into Albany, right to the top part. I think the signal should reach it. It depends on people's receivers, how well they work. If they're able to pick up that signal among other noise that will come in from other FM stations, they can pick up the Americas station. It's a pretty powerful one. And as well as we have that in Augusta, goes over into South Carolina. And we have LaGrange. It's not a big station, LaGrange. It's not very powerful. It does cover the city of LaGrange, I think, itself. So pray about that, and especially our worldwide outreach online, on the internet. And I say that once more, not as an afterthought. I just believe if everyone here will think, if she or he will think to pray, in particular, if it's the Lord's will, and we pray it is the Lord's will, that our programs be heard, then I don't see how that could in any way hurt our cause, do you? And I would see how it has great potential for helping our cause. All right, so where did we stop last time? Thank you. We'll start at verse 28, Jesus before Pilate. Yeah, we covered last time the issue of Peter's denial. Talked about all the questions that arise. And I probably shouldn't say anything more about it. I just get off on the subject of the veracity of the Bible, the truthfulness of Scripture, that is, in comparison to many false allegations made today, even by those who claim to be friends of the Bible. They profess themselves to be Bible believers, but when pressed on that, they don't really think the Bible was true in everything, or is true in all that is affirmed. So we're not going to go back into that, but we did give an answer. And the answer, just to summarize the answer that I would give to those who charge any kind of discrepancies found in the account of Peter's denial, is if a plausible harmonization is offered, and several have been for the minor questions that arise, then only boneheadedness, I would think, stubbornness, deep-seated prejudice would persist in charging the Bible with making a mistake. When there's always that option there, let's just say we have option A, the Bible was wrong, option B, C, and D, the Bible was right, and here's how you harmonize it, B, C, and D. Somebody can say, well, we don't know if B, C, or D is right. Which one is right? It would be really not necessary to know if B, C, or D is right, to know B, C, and D exist as live options, plausible options that historically would fit, biblically would fit. Now, if that's the case, then to press, well, the point is there, it must be error. It has to be wrong. We'll select option A. The Bible was wrong on this point. It's to portray a presupposition about the Bible or an attitude about the Bible already that it's not helpful. It's going to be very unbecoming on the day of judgment. And I say that again to brothers in Christ, those who are still around influenced by the liberals. I use the term liberal brethren, not carelessly, but that was the very term that one I'm thinking of used in his own scholarly writings when he argued the Bible is not the inerrant word of God, and he did identify himself with what he called the theologically liberal position. So I don't think that's unfair to use his terminology, is it? All right, so let's don't spend any more time on that one, but now move on to see, after being before the Sanhedrin, the court of the Jews, under Caiaphas's leadership at the time, he was the official high priest, which, by the way, was what we do sometimes call in derision a kangaroo court, because it was not meeting according to the strictures of Jewish jurisprudence at the time. The law had said you cannot meet at night. And you can see why. You can see why. For fairness' sake, for justice's sake, to have a midnight meeting, a courtroom that convenes while most people are not paying attention, is just inviting monkey business, is it not? Now, does it not make common sense why we would want them to be done in the day and have court open for others to hear? So this was their rule. They were not to have court at night, but they did. They held a court at night. And then, as we said, evidently, to harmonize all the biblical statements in the four Gospels, evidently, they came back and ratified the decision they'd already come to the night before illegally. They ratified that illegal decision by having a day court and putting their stamp of official approval on it. Now, they can't legally at this time put Jesus to death. They can't at this time put Jesus to death. There's a lot of discussion about that point, a lot of controversy, and I think it's needless. There are scholars who get hung up, and I mean really hung up, in the tedium of trying to find out exactly what Roman law was in any given year in the time when the Judean people were occupied by the Romans. Did they ever allow the Jews to execute someone according to Jewish law without having to invoke the law of Rome, to ratify the decision made for capital punishment? Did it ever happen? And there are ambiguous statements made by secular historians of the era. It looks like some have thought maybe at times the Jews were given a little bit more leeway, a little bit more sovereignty, and could do that. But evidently at this period of time that's being narrated in our text, when Pilate was he was the procurator, like we would call governor generally, like a governor of Rome, over the affairs of Judea. During this period of time, the Romans had not allowed that of the Jews. But then you say, wait a minute, the Jews would stone Stephen later and they don't go to Pilate's court to get permission. That's true. But nobody ever said that. That didn't even have the thin veneer of being an actual court proceeding. They're trying to make this look like a real court. The Sanhedrin had decided Jesus had to die, but they couldn't execute him. They had to go get Roman permission. But in the case of Stephen, it was an extrajudicial killing, and they made no bones about it. They just got angry and killed him on the spot. So yes, that has happened a number of times in history. I don't see why we need to get hung up on that question. At this point, we see they were not technically allowed to execute someone without the Romans over them. Now, what does that tell you if you want to wax philosophical and just think about politics in general, the political world? It tells you politics is about who is in control over whom, who can have the final say over what everybody is supposed to do. And it involves force, usually, to be able to get that done. Hopefully it's just force that's regulated by laws and principles that ultimately derive from moral principles from God. That is to be hoped. But the reality is in many places it's not. It's just power. Might makes right idea. So the question of what is a political group, what is a political entity in charge? Basically, I think the definition of a government is that organization of men that has the final say about the use of force within its territory. That sounds kind of crass. It almost sounds like Mao's dictum that political power comes at the muzzle of a gun. That's just real politic, and that's just hardcore politics. Yeah, the communists knew if you've got more guns and you can win, then your politics will win out. That's just might makes right concept, of course. But even apart from that view, who bears the sword on God's behalf in society? Who has the ultimate authority even to take life for, say, a capital offense? Well, Paul explains in Romans 13, 1-8, it's civil government, which is ordained of God. So who had the ultimate control? The Judeans had some limited autonomy, but the Romans let them know we have the final say, and the say over the use of force, that's the final say. That shows the Romans they had hegemony over the entire known world, and especially Judea. That's probably a worthless point for a Bible class, but it's just interesting to me to think about. All right, so this means they'll have to go to the Romans now, to Pilate. He is the procurator at that time. Verse 28, then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters, so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. Now, what's that all about? Well, why wouldn't they go into the headquarters? If you were invited to Buckingham Palace, would you go? I saw somebody the other day that really enjoyed it. When he was invited, kind of scared me, enjoyed a little bit too much, because he's got to watch out. There's a shell game going on, in my opinion. But anyway, be careful, not to get too ego-stroked over that sort of thing. You're invited into the court, to the Praetorian Guard's house, well, actually the house of Caiaphas. They wouldn't go in because Caiaphas, it's not Caiaphas, Pilate. Pilate was what, ethnically?
Well, he was a Gentile.
He was not a Jew. He was not a practicing Jew. He was not circumcised. So their traditions told them they could not get near him, couldn't go under his roof, or they would be defiled by that pagan. I wish some of our people had thought about that, about defilement. Well, anyway, never mind. We'll move on, not talk about that. So Pilate went outside to them and said, he accommodated them. Pilate's not the greatest guy in the world, but a lesser magistrate might have said, well, phooey on you. You won't come in. I'm not even going to listen to your request. So he accommodated. He went out to them, went outside of them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? So he knew what the situation was, that they had so-called tried Jesus, and now they wanted the Romans to execute Jesus based on Roman law. So to do it by the book, Pilate wanted to know what Roman laws, of course, would matter. They're going to give answers, and Pilate won't see them all as germane. They answered him, if this man were not doing evil, would we not have delivered him over to you, or we would not have delivered him over to you? Now just think about that answer. Is that really a direct answer, or is that a deflecting of the prince? It sounds so modern, doesn't it? Sounds like the houses they debate, one side of the aisle against the other. What's the accusation you bring against this man? Like, you don't think we know how to choose when somebody is an evildoer and is deserving of death? And we have to specify? Yeah, you got to specify that. The Romans would say, yeah, you're going to have to specify. So Pilate sensed something was up here. This was strictly a religious question. Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. Well, of course, they allegedly had done that right through the night sessions we spoke about. The Jews, a broke record. Again, we can stop here and say, isn't it foolish how people accuse the New Testament, especially the Gospel of John, of being anti-Semitic? How absurd. The author was John, one of Jesus' disciples, and someone who evidently had a little standing in the Jerusalem community. The aristocrats knew him. He was known by the high priest. He was the family. John was a Jew through and through. All the early Christians were. The first Christians were. And So it is alleged that since the term the Jews is used, rather than saying the Jewish authorities, some would say you need to go back and correct it and say the Jewish authorities said this, because not all Jews said it. But hold on. We see that by the time Jesus is going to be led out to be crucified, all of Jerusalem, including those who earlier in the week had said, Hosanna, blessed be he that cometh in the name of the Lord, and put up their palm branches in deference to Jesus riding on the donkey. As Jesus comes in as the triumphal king, within a week, they're stirred up to turn against him. It's not just the Jewish authorities, it was the Jews. Somebody said, but he had disciples. Yes, of course, there were exceptions. But by and large, the authorities, as well as a large number of the population, had turned on Jesus by this time. So it's accurate to say the Jews, and that they are represented. These are the Jewish authorities from the delegation from the Sanhedrin. And the Jews said this to him. So it's ridiculous to call the New Testament anti-Semitic. That's number one from that strictly historical point of view. Number two is you have to ask, what is the purpose of a New Testament? Well, it's to show that the Old Testament has now been fulfilled. Well, what was it? That was the law of Moses given to the Jews who prepared all the world, including themselves as a nation, for salvation. So why did Jesus come? To save them and everybody else. But if one continues just to remain in Judaism and fails to see Christ, Jesus of Nazareth is Christ, he is their Messiah, our Messiah, they fail to see that, then it's accurate to just say they're the Jews. And thirdly, to call them anti-Semitic is kind of funny, because many Arabs are Semites. Isn't that weird? You think of only the Hebrew people or Israelites as Semites? No. The word comes from Shem, one of the sons of Noah, and there were many descendants of Shem that are not of the Israelite nation. So it's not even, I know it's hallowed with usage, it's not even really accurate from a philological point, just the standpoint of the development of words, to say anti-Semitic. And if your purpose in telling a Jew you're wrong about that is because you love that individual human being and you want that individual to cease from practicing a religion that's now false or defunct in God's sight and has been changed as false, your purpose is to save that person's soul. I can't think of anything less anti-Semitic than that goal of reaching the Jews for Christ.
I guess by that logic, Peter would also be anti-Semitic because of
they claim that,
the sermon on Day of Pentecost. But my point was going to be, on that day, 3,000, and that's the minimum. That's the baseline, right? People were converted that day. But why were they converted? They were saying they were pricked in their hearts because they knew that they had killed him. And so again, we're not talking about just a handful of people. We're talking about thousands and thousands of people that felt like they had contributed to in some way Jesus' death, right?
Yeah, they had.
So that's not just that's an indictment of a large swath.
That's a good point, that they apparently recognized their guilt over the fact when Peter made that accusation, they didn't say, well, we told the leaders to leave him alone. That never came up. They realized, you see, they had turned on Jesus. In the beginning of that week, they had welcomed him. But I think the problem was they had welcomed him because they completely misunderstood his messiahship. Now, what did the Jews typically think Messiah would do when he came? What would be Messiah's big purpose?
He'd come with a sword.
Yeah, but what's their situation right now? It's right here in the text. I mean,
under the heel of the Romans.
Exactly. They're under the gun, under the sword of the Romans. They have no real autonomy. And they're looking back wistfully to the days of King David and Solomon. David, the great king, and he was. And that was a glorious time for Israel. And their borders were expanded from the Euphrates all the way down to the wadi of a river of Egypt, which is a wadi down in the Sinai, showing they had a vast extent as the promises had been made. They enjoyed all that under David and Solomon, especially Solomon, who reaped the benefits of his father David. They looked at that time and they thought, we need our heyday once again. We need it where we have hegemony as the Jewish nation. And actually, I think many of them would have preferred to be the top dogs in all the world. Just as today, the theory is being taught among premillennialists that that's what's going to happen. Yeah, Jesus is going to come and he's going to establish that very kind of kingdom. They were looking for a carnal kingdom, right? In other words, I say carnal in the sense of just physical, right? A physical kingdom. We're in a carnal kingdom in the other sense today, but they're looking for that, right? And so when they see Jesus come in, it's triumph. Blessed be he that cometh in the name of the Lord. By the end of the week, though, those hopes, physical hopes, were dashed, and they realized that's not why he's here. So they turned on him. Of course, they were instigated too. Instigators. The Jewish leaders are culpable in that sense that they instigated. They hatched a plot to get rid of him, and they got everybody on board. It's just amazing how fickle people are, the masses. Even today, you see things happening. You see cultural trends, and they will develop overnight, as it were. Oh, we think the whole country is going conservative now. Everybody's tired of what used to be, last year, a few months ago. They won't ever go back to that again. Don't underestimate the fickleness of our people or anybody else in the world. That's what's scary, isn't it? Things can change on a dime. They can change from one moment to the next for apparently no good reason sometimes, it seems like. So I'm just saying, never underestimate how flighty and fickle and unfounded people are in their beliefs. Many can be swayed just by the influencers of the moment. And these influences told them to say, let him be crucified. They actually are going to coax them, call for Barabbas, so then to be released. We'll see that. All right, let's go and read this. So the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. So don't quibble, don't argue, don't spend thousands of hours and all kinds of ink over whether that's true or not. They said it, and this is a silly kind of quibble to me. The fact this is put here in this book at this period of time and attributed to them, and it's never ever challenged by any early writers to say, oh, the New Testament's wrong because they got this question wrong, is to me telling that this was the case at that time. It was not within their prerogative. That should be settled. And I know you may wonder, why do you get off on that so much? Because it's a big issue out there in some scholarly circles. They want to debate that. Yes, they said it was unlawful, and I believe it. And Pilate didn't argue with him either. This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So, in other words, now, put these pieces of the puzzle together by saying we can't put him to death. You, the Romans, will have to be the ones to do it now. Then the Romans will execute him according to their standard execution method, which was, at this time, here, what was the standard execution method for capital crucifixion? All right, so crucifixion is a unique way of killing someone, because what do you do to the crucified person? Do you put them in the ground and bury them alive? No. What do?
Put them on a tree.
Put them on a tree, hang them on a tree, and they die an agonizingly slow death, bleeding to death, all kinds of agony and trauma. All right, so that's the way the Romans would do it. Now, did Jesus ever talk about going to the tree, going to being hung up before others, to hanged up, or however you... Well, yes, he did. He spoke about how, if I am lifted up, I will draw all men unto me. And John had already said earlier, he spoke about the manner of death he would die. So John is saying, Jesus gave foreshadowings here and there in his ministry. But he's going to be crucified. He's not going to be stoned to death, which is what you would expect of the Jews. See, if they had retained capital punishment authority, they would have used stones. That's how they would have done it. But the Gentiles are going to use another method. Verse 33. So Pilate entered his headquarters again. Excuse me. I'm not getting choked up with text, but I'm just getting choked up. I apologize. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Well, where did that question come from? What do we know that had been said earlier by Jesus and about Jesus? Well, now, in the first part of that week, what had the Jews themselves already done to show respect to Jesus when he came in riding the donkey, the triumphal entry? What had they said? Hosanna. You know, they had received him as their conquering king. They thought he'd be the conquering king. They had high hopes at the beginning of the week he was going to make those changes and get rid of the Romans, get them out of their midst. So this was not unknown, I'm sure, to the Romans, this event. And what was being said, the implication is he's our king. This sort of thing was getting out, that Jesus was going to be king of the Jews. Well, they want him to be a king like David, a conquering military hero. And he is the king of the Jews. Pilate doesn't understand what that means, but he had heard that claim was made, so he asked him point blank, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered with a question, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" So now, evidently, I think we know what the answer was. It's not that Pilate was that well aware of all of Jesus' teachings, but he'd heard tidbits here and there. And no doubt when they came to him to request that he put Jesus to death, he had already gotten word of what their charges were. He claimed to be the king of the Jews. See, they had to sugarcoat what they were doing. Their real motives was envy. Peter would say later it was through envy they did. The real motive was envy. But the feigned motive was love of the Roman Empire. And we like our position as a vassal to Rome. And he's going to upset the apple cart. He's a traitor. So we're going to turn him in. We're doing our civic duty to turn in this traitor. He's claiming to be the king of the Jews, which would mean he's usurping authority that only the emperor of Rome should have, right? Who's the king of the Jews. So when Pilate asked this question, Jesus made a pertinent question on his own, gave one. Is this something you came up with, or did somebody put this into you to ask me that? And of course, Pilate answered with another question. It's just a bunch of questions. Am I a Jew? So, was he? Well, no, he was not a Jew. Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done? So one thing you can say on Pilate's behalf now is he's fair about it. He's giving the accused the chance to make his case before him. And of course, the issue, the charge that had been given to Pilate was that Jesus claimed to be the king of the Jews. And so he explains about that, since Pilate didn't know, my kingdom is not of this world. That should disarm him right now, right? Because Pilate worked for a man whose kingdom was, the Roman emperor, was of this world. So he says, my kingdom is not of this world. And then Jesus gives what instructors in colleges like to say is a counterfactual hypothesis. In other words, a what-if scenario. What if my kingdom were of this world, on the same level, on the same footing as the Roman Empire, for example? Suppose my kingdom were of this world, a physical kingdom. How would I maintain that power to have sway over others without might, without force? My servants would have been fighting. In other words, force is the sine qua non, the essential point of a legitimate civil government. He says, so I would be fighting. It'd be war. That I might not be delivered over to the Jews. Now stop and think about how reasonable does that sound to us today? Or what would Pilate have thought when he heard Jesus counterfactual? First of all, in the indicative, you just write out, says, he declares, my kingdom is not of this world. So that should be enough to disarm. So you don't have to worry about it. I do not make claim to being the kind of ruler they're charging me with. They were using a fallacy of equivocation, you might say, in logic. They were saying, claim to be king. Well, yeah, but king of the world in the sense of the Lord of all mankind. That was what he was claiming. He was claiming to be God, but he was not claiming to be the next person to sit on the throne of the emperor of Rome, or to have independence for Judah and Palestine and to rule from there. He was not claiming that. So he says, if I were that kind of kingdom, don't you think I would be have an army trained and they'd be out fighting? Did his servants fight? Well, the only one who tried it was an abortive attempt was what? Remember we read it last time? Peter, he tried it, but Jesus stopped he nipped it in the butt. That's not what we're trying to do. I wish our premillennial friends today grasp what the Bible is saying on this point. Hey, brother, come in. It's not what Jesus came for, and certainly is not what he will come back for, to establish a physical kingdom of Israel, or Israelis ruling over the entire world out of Jerusalem.
I don't mean to bring politics into it too much, but it kind of reminds me of the argument about how somebody wants to overthrow the government and doesn't bother to bring any guns or anything. They just protest peacefully, and somehow that's worthy of lots of jail time and ostracizing from society.
So you sense hypocrisy.
But cold-blooded murder, that's okay if it's hate speech involved. Anyway.
Point well taken. It's kind of hard to avoid some of those parallels that you see. They're kind of obvious, aren't they? Anyway,
it just shows you that power is always people that are in charge are just going to do what they want to do, and they're going to find whatever reason to do what they want to do. They're going to justify it.
The wise man said long ago, "There's nothing new under the sun. That which hath been before shall be." In other words, history just continually repeats itself. The names change, sometimes the same names, but the names change, but it's always the same. Sinful man trying to have his way over God's way, and all the specifics of history can be attributed back to that. So nothing really new here. You're right. That's why we see parallels today. These things are going on. All right. So his kingdom, he says, not of the. And here's the logical reason why you should know that, Pilate. Think about it. You have not known me. Jesus was not accused of bringing in an army, an insurgency. There's an armed rebellion. There were some in his day that had tried that before him and would later. Judas and Theudas would come along, as mentioned in the book of Acts. They would be guerrilla warriors, and they would try to lead a faction of the Jewish people to physically overthrow Roman rule. And they thought of the kingdom as of this world. It's like premillennialists do today, that his kingdom is going to be of this world. My kingdom is not of this world, or it's not from the world. We've talked about that a lot in the last few months, especially when we had our little mini-series on Sunday morning in worship about the book of Daniel. We didn't cover it all, but we looked at some of the major prophecies in Daniel, and especially the one about the kingdom to come, which would be the everlasting kingdom. That's Christ's kingdom. His kingdom is not of this world. But does anybody say it is today? I'm going to pick on them. Yes, they deserve it. They're destroying evangelical Christianity. You had Chiliasm from the earliest 2nd or 3rd century. Chiliasm comes from the word for 1,000. The idea that the 1,000 years mentioned in Revelation 20 would be a literal period of time. And then the allegation being Christ would come back to the earth and literally reign in a kingdom of this world, Christ's kingdom of this world, politically over the world for 1,000 years. Now that's been around for almost 2,000 years, about maybe 1,700, 1,800 years. It's come and it's gone, but it almost always was considered just a heresy, a loony idea, and wrong, contrary to all these kinds of teachings, like my kingdom is not of this world. That's why it was not widely accepted. Now, there were troublemakers, there were rebellious types throughout history, such as in the Reformation. Some came along after the time of Luther, and there was a peasants' revolt in Germany at the time. And Luther was thought it was abhorrent to him. In fact, he would want to turn them in. He had nothing to do with the peasants, who thought, if we can cast off the tyranny of the mind from Rome, why can't we not cast off the tyranny of Roman leaders, their political sway? They also hold over. It's kind of a holdover from the old Holy Roman Empire. Why can't we do that? And so the peasants revolted, and they had leaders to take staves and pitchforks and knives and go out and set barns on fire. And it was a major bloody affair, very bad. And usually it involved people, I think it's Thomas Munster, who was one of the major leaders, who had an apocalyptic vision. It's our time now to establish the kingdom of God, a physical kingdom on earth by force. This is, they'd say today, the Battle of Armageddon. And he was defeated. So the Reformation had kind of unleashed that genie out of the bottle. But it had been around in other times too. There have been instances in British history, in English history, where those sorts of ideas had popped up, and charismatic figures would come along and try to force the issue with force and would be put out. So I just don't know how many times we can say, when the Schofield Bible came out in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, with its notes in the bottom of the Bible, it set the evangelical world on fire, taking what had been basically an apparent goofy idea of Jehovah's Witnesses types, the Watchtower group, who'd spoken about the millennial kingdom physically come to the earth. And people like Baptists of all people, good Bible-believing people on so many levels, had picked that up and had run with that ball, and now it's everywhere. Not all. Let me point this out. Not all Baptists are premillennialists. It was known for a good while, I don't know how it is today, that the Baptist Seminary in New Orleans, I used to go use books out of their library when I lived there, New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, was a champion of the non-millenarian view among Baptists. Then you had Dallas Theological Seminary in Dallas, Texas, among Baptists that championed premillennialism. So the two schools clash. One school labeled one as being ultra right and the other is ultra left, but there was no left and right involved. It's just there were Baptists who did reject that whole point of view. So premillennialism has been around for a long time. Now it has popped up again with a vengeance, and it has infiltrated many places. Come right in, y'all. We're about to finish up our Bible class. Y'all have a seat anywhere you'd like, and then we'll take a break for a few minutes so other kids will come in from the back. There you go. And we'll have a few minutes between sessions, and we'll start our worship. Well, what we were studying here is in John chapter 18, verses, say 36 and following, where Jesus was telling Pilate when he was before him on trial, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world. So it was not to be a physical kingdom." Hey, brother. Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king, and he is the king of the Jews." Let's go ahead and finish this section before we take our break, where he says down in John 18 and verse 37. Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king." Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king." Now, I think we get the idea here, sometimes we get the wrong idea from the way this is translated. It means that's just your opinion. That's not what Jesus is saying. When he says, "you say," or I think the King James had the language, "thou sayest," or something of that nature. You say that I'm a king. In other words, all right, you just uttered the words, "I am a king." And then he says, "For this purpose I was born." He doesn't deny it. That's my point. He is a king, but not a physical king in the same sense that military men are. "For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth." All right, so now we know why Jesus came. Does anybody have to wonder and guess at it? He tells us. Why did he come to the world? He says, it's kind of a general statement, of course. You have to fill in the blanks with a study of other things Jesus teaches. But here's the bottom line. I came to bear witness to the truth. All right. Now Pilate knows, right? Now Pilate understands why Jesus is here. He's on trial before Pilate. But Pilate has a question. When Jesus said, "I came to bear witness to the truth," it's the kind of question that comes up today. It still would come up. If you were to go into a big university setting, and you would say, "Students and teacher, we've got to stand for the truth." After they finish chuckling, some of them, they'd probably say, what? They'd say exactly what? It would be a question like we were about to read. Pilate said when he said that, verse 38, "What is truth?" What is truth? Does this mean no one can ever know? Did Jesus know the truth? Yes. He came into the world to bear witness to the truth. Had Pilate heard about the truth? No, he had not been informed correctly to know the truth. So he was a lot like, his philosophical upbringing in the schools of his day in Greece, the Greek influence over Rome. He was raised a Roman, and he had heard about all the different philosophical leaders like Plato and Aristotle, and they had talked about things like truth, and nobody could ever give a solid answer. What really is truth? So Pilate was so typical of people of his day and our own. What is truth? So when the reader reads this and the reader thinks to himself, I'm so thankful to have this book of John where I can go through the whole book and I can get a big picture of what truth is. It's what Jesus teaches. After he said this, he went back outside of the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. Now, in other words, according to Roman law, he's not worthy of execution. But you, talking to the Jews, have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Talking about Jesus. They cried out again, not this man, not the king of the Jews, Jesus, but Barabbas. Huh? And we'd rather you let Barabbas go. Now, who is Barabbas? Was he a good guy? No. And they knew he wasn't. He was a robber. Let him go. No cash bail. Just let him out. Don't let him stay long. I'm going to let... The Romans had this nice custom in a way. They were going to let one or the other go. Who do you want to go? And they wanted Barabbas instead of Jesus. Wow. A lot to be said there. We may return to that point again, Lord willing, next week. But at this time, we'll go ahead and we went over a little bit, and I apologize for that. We will mark our page there at John 18, end of 18. And we'll take a few minutes. The other will be in just a moment, I'm sure.